Hey, so let's get started with setting up Mixpanel. So the first thing while setting up Mixpanel is actually to get your Mixpanel token and then installing and configuring your SDK. How do you find your Mixpanel token? Super simple. When you go to Mixpanel, go to settings, go to project settings, scroll down, you'll see access keys. Just in that, you're gonna see project token, copy that, right? Uh, Quick note for you, so you can create unlimited projects within an organization, and each project has a unique token for sending data to it. So yeah, feel free to create as many projects as you want. Typically, you'd ideally want to have two projects, so one for development or staging and one for production, right? So you can test in the development project whenever you add new events, new data, and then once everything is checked, you could just push it to the production project, right? Now, how do you install and configure your SDK? So to start sending your data to Mixpanel, you need to install and set up the SDK, and Mixpanel offers a variety of client-side and server-side SDKs. So if you look at a few client-side SDKs, you're gonna see that, okay, we have all of these, right? So we have Python, we have Java, React Native, Flutter, iOS, Android, Unity, so on and so forth. And you also have a list of server-side SDKs, so which is Python, Node.js, PHP, Go, Java, right? And I've linked it here so that you guys can go through it. It's easier for you to find the documentation. For demonstration in this course, we are going to use the JavaScript client-side SDK. So the first thing, you need to go to the install Mixpanel documentation, which is this. Now here you need to add this, so you need to install the SDK. So the first snippet, and they've also mentioned where exactly you need to paste it. So it needs to be pasted just before the closing of the head tag. And then the second code that you need to add is configuring your SDK. And here you're just gonna replace your token with your project token, and you're just gonna add it just below the below this code, right? Quick thing here, so track page view is equal to true. This is extremely important in case you want to use the Mixpanel auto track. So in case you turn this off to false or you do not have this parameter, Mixpanel is not automatically going to track all of your page views. But if you turn this on, what Mixpanel will do is it'll automatically fire up an event named page view, which will have, okay, a user visited this page, that page, right? So on each URL change, you'll have an event firing. So make sure to keep this and turn it on to true, because it's going to be super helpful for you. Okay, next. So now it's time to send data to Mixpanel, right? So sure, you have auto track, but you want to have a lot of custom events with properties for you to go deeper into analysis, right? And so now how are we going to send data, right, to Mixpanel is by using Mixpanel.track calls, right? Okay, so let's first talk about user identification, right, before we actually even get into tracking events, because I think user identification is a big part of Mixpanel, and Mixpanel works on a user level. So you need to ensure that anonymous user, a signed up user, if they're actually the same user, they have the same user profile, so that your analysis would make a lot of sense. Otherwise it's going to break at different places. So the first thing is, so when you send data to Mixpanel, a random distinct ID is automatically assigned to the user by Mixpanel, right? And this ID is stored in the user's cookies or local storage. Now, if the user clears their cookies, switches browser devices, uses a subdomain, the ID will be lost, and Mixpanel will generate a new ID for that user. So to avoid this, it's always better to set a unique user ID, like any UUID or email, as soon as the user authenticates on your website, right? So this way you can track users across different devices. So now let's take a scenario on how this would work. Let's say you have a user that comes to your website, right? They have a random distinct ID as called A. They authenticate, and so now you've assigned email as the distinct ID, which is, let's just say, ansh@gmail.com. And now tomorrow they actually go to a separate browser, and there they have their ID as B, random ID, because that browser does not know who this user is, and then they authenticate there using ansh@gmail.com. And then what Mixpanel is going to do is that it's actually going to merge both those user activity into a single user, right? Because we know that it's the same user. But if we didn't authenticate, if we didn't set the email as the user ID when a user authenticates, how are you even gonna know who the user is, right? The Mixpanel code for that is very simple. So it's mixpanel.identify new ID, when new ID is the user's UUID or email, right? And what this does is it actually replaces the default Mixpanel ID, and then the same user, like I said, can be tracked on different devices. Ideally, you would want to call the identify function on sign up and login, or wherever you feel you're actually getting the user's email. There are few products where you get the email as soon as the user lands up on the website, so you might as well call it there, right? One quick note: so if multiple users share the same device, please call mixpanel.reset at logout to reset the ID. Otherwise, it can create problems going forward. Okay. Now, in Mixpanel, so I just gave you an example of how the ID would actually be merged in Mixpanel. So the same user on browser 1 has ID random ID A, and then same user on browser 2 would have random ID B, but after authentication they would merge together. So now this merging happens on Mixpanel in two ways majorly, right? So there's simplified ID merge and there's original ID merge. Simplified ID merge is the latest method that's suggested by Mixpanel. Original ID merge is the method that was going on till date, although you can choose between the two, but we're gonna I'm just gonna quickly talk about a few differences between them, and that will probably help make sense. So the original ID merge uses the identify call to link an anonymous ID to a known user ID. So let's say a user visits your site anonymously, Mixpanel assigns a device ID like device 123. The user signs up and then you assign them a user ID like user 456. So then what the identify function does is it will merge the anonymous ID, which is device 123, with user 456, and all future events are tracked with user 456, consolidating the user's actions, right? Now in original ID merge, what also happens is, let's say you want to keep so you have an anonymous ID that's linked to a single user ID called user 456, but let's say you actually want to link it to more user IDs, or user probably on a changes their email, you want to change the UUID. If you want to do anything of that sort, you could still do that in original ID merge by again calling mixpanel.identify, and the ID would be updated. So let's say the new ID for that same user could actually be user 123, for example, right? So you can have one anonymous ID that can have mapping to multiple user IDs. So that's possible in original ID merge, which is something that's not possible in simplified ID merge. So simplified ID merge streamlines identity management using two key properties, so device ID and user ID. So again, a user interacts with their app anonymously, so events are all tagged with device ID. After logging in, when you call mixpanel.identify, events actually would include device ID as well as user ID, and Mixpanel would merge them, attributing all events to the user ID. Now the only difference here is that, let's say you call the same user, you call mixpanel.identify for the same user with user 123, it's actually going to create a different profile, even though they might have the same anonymous ID, because in Mixpanel, one device ID can only have one mapping to a user ID. And also in simplified ID merge, you can actually, instead of calling mixpanel.identify, you could actually track it in your events, right? So you could just call the device ID with the dollar operator and the user ID with the dollar operator in your event properties, instead of calling mixpanel.identify, right? But even then, if you want to still use mixpanel.identify, you could still use that. Like that's up to you, but this is the key difference. Okay, now let's move on to one of the challenges that I've seen a lot of people face that have subdomains. That how do you actually keep your ID consistent across subdomains? Okay, so now there are two ways to handle this, right? And ideally there are actually two situations, right? So the first situation is, let's say you have example.com and you have app.example.com. So app.example.com is a direct subdomain of example.com. In that case, when you're initializing it, when you're initializing Mixpanel, you could just have cross subdomain cookies and set it to true. What this would do is essentially just make sure that Mixpanel tracks when a user moves from example.com to app.example.com, it would track the user as the same user, right? The problem, it gets more complicated when you have subdomains like example.com and then let's say for example app.example.net, right? It's not a direct subdomain now because .com is very different to .net, and so in this case you would actually make use of query parameters. And let's take an example, right? So you have a user on example.com, they have a random they have an ID called let's say abc123, right? Now what you're gonna do is you're gonna fetch that from Mixpanel, right? So there's a function called Mixpanel, I think, get distinct ID. That's the function. So you're going to fetch that from Mixpanel, and then you're actually going to append it to any CTA that has a link that's going to app.example.net, right? What I mean by that is let's actually take hello.com. That's the example that I mentioned here, so I think it might be easier for you. So let's say a user comes to hello.com, has the ID abc123, they click on a CTA that actually takes them to app.hello.net, which so I'm just going to make this hello.net just for simplicity. Okay, so on this link, what you're going to do is you're going to automatically attach the Mixpanel distinct ID as a query parameter, right? So your link would no longer be app.hello.net, but would actually be app.hello.net and user ID is equal to abc123. And so now when user lands on app.hello.net with the link as this, you would eventually just extract the user ID parameter and set it as a distinct ID using Mixpanel.identify. What this would do is very simple. So across, when the user would be tracked on Mixpanel, because they are identified using the same distinct ID, they're going to have the same profile. And that's how you can track the same user across domains. Okay, cool. So let's move on to auto track. I think I already explained this, but while configuring your SDK, set track page view is equal to true, so that Mixpanel automatically tracks all of your page views, right? Now let's move on to event tracking, right? So to track an event along with properties for JavaScript code is very, very simple. You have mixpanel.track, then you have the event name, which is called sign up in our case, and then you have source, which is Google, email is equal to ansh@gmail.com. So these are the properties, and you can have unlimited, like I don't think unlimited, there's a limit of 200 properties that you can have, but yeah. And ideally, so with source, right now I've hard-coded it Google and I've hard-coded the email as ansh@gmail.com. In your case, ideally it's going to be a variable that contains the value, right? Okay, if you want to set profile properties, let's say you want to set email as a profile properties, you're just going to call mixpanel.people.set on email, and obviously it's using comma separator, you can add as many profile properties as you want in the same call. When you want to have super properties, you're just going to call mixpanel.register email at ansh@gmail.com. Now, in case you want to update the email later on, you could actually again call mixpanel.register later on and it would update it. But let's say in some cases you actually just want to set the super property once and never update it. In that case, you could actually use mixpanel.register once, right? So it works very similar to mixpanel.register, but it's just that it won't override super properties that are already set. So if once email is set, no matter if there's an email change or anything of that sort, it's not going to override the previous email. Okay, now lastly, incremental properties. So you can also track numeric properties like the number of items downloaded and increment them each time the user performs an action. So for example, mixpanel.people.increment number of items downloaded, right? So what this is going to do is, let's say you have a property called number of items downloaded, and whenever a user downloads another item, this property should ideally increment by 1. So instead of calculating or storing that number on your own end, you could just call mixpanel.people.increment for that property, and it would just increment it by 1. In case you want to increment it by a value that's not one, or increment multiple values, then you could have mixpanel.people.increment, and you could be like, okay, I want to increment revenue by 500, I want to increment number of saved images by 17, so on and so forth, right?